In 1981, a witness told investigators of a double murder in Idaho. Near a trapper's camp, they found a game warden's body. A second warden's body was missing, along with the killer, Claude Dallas. Investigators would track the mountain man through unforgiving country he knew better than anyone. In an area known for anti-government sentiments, the FBI knew the manhunt would be difficult, but Dallas must be found.
The sun set on the Wild West long ago, but some people refused to notice. Claude Dallas was one of them. A wily trapper, distrustful of authority, Dallas typified the rugged individualism that forged this country. He went too far when he killed 2 game wardens in 1981. The law that he despised so much began to close in. But Dallas knew the land and could live off it as long as he needed to. Finding him wouldn't be easy. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. A man like Dallas could hide almost anywhere. The severity of his crime demanded that we never stop looking. A modern-day posse formed to round up the maverick and deliver him to justice.
On January 5th, 1981, Jim Stevens arrived at a friend's trapping camp, bringing provisions as promised. He fired warning shots to report his arrival. He knew his host didn't like being surprised by unannounced visitors. The trapper, Claude Dallas, had created the gunshot warning system.
Howdy, Jim.
He was protective of his compound. Dallas was glad to have the supplies. He was trapping for the winter in Bull Basin, a remote area in southwestern Idaho near the Nevada border. He had bagged a few bobcats out of season and planned to sell their furs in the spring. But he needed food before that to sustain him. Besides restocking Dallas's camp, Stevens had come to look for Indian artifacts. He planned to search along the river. In such an isolated area, he was bound to find new items for his collection. Dallas stayed to look over his new provisions. Stevens was away for only a short time. Overhearing raised voices, Jim Stevens soon returned to the camp. He found his friend was not alone. Dallas was arguing with 2 game wardens, Bill Pogue and Conley Elms.
Oh, you got a gun, sir?
Stevens noticed Dallas's shoulder holster was empty. Though the wardens rarely met with trouble, few woodsmen were happy to see them. They requested Stevens' gun, following standard field procedure.
All right, talk to me again. Are you up here with him?
Yeah. He's just bringing
Pogue and Dallas argued about the bobcat skins hanging nearby. In Idaho, the season hadn't opened yet.
Season started 2 weeks ago.
I know where they came from. Nevada. Those aren't from Nevada.
Dallas's temper rose as he fumbled for an excuse. Their argument intensified.
I know where they came from. Now we can make this easy.
Pogue mentioned a citation, further angering the trapper. Then Warden Elms entered Dallas's tent to look for more contraband. Dallas became furious, insisting they needed a search warrant.
Sir, I said stop it.
Warden Pogue turned his attention to the tent. Suddenly, Dallas was firing a gun. He had drawn a .357 he had kept hidden and emptied it into the unsuspecting wardens. Without a word, Dallas reached for his .22 rifle and carefully aimed behind the ear of Bill Pogue. Conley Elms met the same fate. Jim Stevens was stunned. Dallas immediately claimed that Pogue had tried to draw his gun. Stevens had turned away just before the shooting began. He wouldn't deny Dallas's
Them or
claim.
me, you saw his hand on his gun. I swore last time I was arrested I'd never go in again.
But did you have to kill him?
But why would the warden have drawn? And why was Elms killed? Maybe his friend had gone crazy.
You find something to cover him up with.
Fearing for his life, Stevens decided it was best to cooperate. He complied with Dallas's orders. Using one of Dallas's mules, they hauled Bill Pogue's body up to the ridge where Stevens' blazer was parked. They dumped the body into the truck and returned to the camp. Conley Elms' body was too heavy for the mule to carry up the hill to the truck. Dallas first suggested they quarter him and haul the pieces. In the end, they dragged him almost half a mile across the rocky ground to the river. That would be Dallas's one mistake. He didn't weight the body. As it floated downriver, it was sure to be seen. As a trapper, Dallas knew about leaving tracks. He must cover his to make it hard on the investigators who would hunt him. Using kerosene, he burned the bloody spots left by moving the bodies. Stevens had to help. Dallas then built 2 small fires to burn the ropes used to move the wardens and some of the warden's equipment. He tried to get rid of anything with blood on it. Dallas never expressed remorse for the killings. To Stevens, Dallas seemed without emotion. It was more reason to fear him. Dallas had to get rid of Bill Pogue's body. He decided to go to a friend's house in Nevada for help. Stevens didn't want to cross Dallas, and it might give him a chance to get away from the killer. They would head for Paradise Hill, Nevada, 5 hours away. As they drove, Dallas tried to convince Stevens that the killings were justifiable homicide. The wardens had invaded his territory and threatened him, he said. He had only defended himself. Stevens couldn't understand how it was self-defense, but he didn't argue. There was no telling what Dallas might do to him. Near the end of their drive, Dallas apologized for involving Stevens. They arrived at the home of George and Liz Nielsen in Paradise Hill, Nevada, around 11 o'clock that night. The Nielsens ran a small tavern out of their house and were just closing for the night.
George! 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 George, it's Claude!
Dallas told his old friend George he had just killed 2 fish and game officers. He needed Nielsen's help. With others around, Jim Stevens no longer feared for his life. But what he had seen and done still terrified him. Dallas told George and Liz Nielsen he had one body outside and that the other was in the river near his camp. George Nielsen shared Dallas's contempt for the law, and he believed the claim of self-defense. He agreed to help. Dallas told Stevens he could go and asked to borrow the Nielsen's pickup to take Pogue's body out and bury it. The men went outside so Dallas could move the body from the blazer to Nielsen's pickup.
Wait a minute.
Stevens could finally head home. Dallas went off alone to get rid of the body. Hours later, he would return to the Nielsens to shower, change clothes, eat, and pack. The Nielsens would give him food and some cash. Around 5:30 a.m., Nielsen would drop him off 15 miles away, where it is believed another friend picked him up. In any case, Claude Dallas had disappeared. A few hours later, Jim Stevens realized he had to go to the police.
Liz.
After talking with George, he visited Liz Nielsen at the local hospital where she worked.
We gotta go to the
She agreed they should contact authorities. They were too involved not to.
We gotta turn him in.
They met with the county prosecutor. Stevens explained that he was there at the time of the shootings, but had his back turned when Dallas started firing.
Exactly what you saw.
We went down the river there.
He didn't see if Pogue had drawn his gun, so Stevens couldn't verify or dispute Dallas's self-defense story. George and Liz Nielsen told how they had helped Dallas disappear, but they didn't know where he was. All anyone knew was that for some reason, Claude Dallas had snapped. He was unpredictable, armed, and out there somewhere. If Stevens were telling the truth, there were 2 lawmen down and a killer on the run. The prosecutor contacted Owyhee County Sheriff Tim Nettleton, who called in state authorities.
I notified the Department of Law Enforcement to gain some assistance because of the expertise that they could supply my department.
As Nettleton prepared to investigate the crime scene to check Stevens' story, the FBI was called in to track Dallas. Special Agent Frank Nenzel, then stationed in Reno, was assigned as the Nevada case agent.
The FBI was called into the investigation of the murders of officers Pogue and Elms because it was believed that Dallas had, first of all, cold-bloodedly murdered these 2 officers, and secondly, that he had fled the state of Idaho to avoid prosecution.
We have thick wooded areas, we have water, and we have some open terrain.
Dallas knew the land and had a head start, but the FBI had to find him. Sheriff Tim Nettleton led the investigation of the crime scene where Claude Dallas had killed the 2 game wardens. He was accompanied by deputies and state forensics experts. An investigator riding in a news helicopter spotted a body in the river. He radioed to the team on the ground, and they located the body of Warden Conley Elms, caught on a submerged tree branch. At least 1 death was verified. Back in the camp, officers approached Dallas's tent with care, on the chance he was lying in wait for them. But only pelts and skins remained. With the area secured, Sheriff Nettleton and the forensics team could begin verifying the rest of Stevens' story. They couldn't rely solely on one witness's testimony. They needed hard evidence that placed Dallas at the scene and proved what happened beyond a reasonable doubt. Investigators videotaped and took photographs to preserve the placement of footprints and other evidence. They were most interested in collecting ballistic evidence. The examiners needed to retrieve the warden's guns and any spent bullets from them. The question was whether the wardens had fired or even drawn their guns. If they had, Dallas may be innocent of murder. Searchers found .357 and .22 caliber shell casings, which they hoped to be able to trace to determine who had fired them. Although evidence had been burned, much still remained. The scorched twigs might yield powerful clues.
In the process, we found where the sagebrush had been piled on human blood, later identified as Bill Pogue's and Conley Elms' blood. and burned, we assume, to destroy the evidence.
It was painstaking work, but their meticulousness was crucial. Even the tiniest traces of evidence would be useful to Idaho State Crime Lab examiner Rick Groff.
There was a number of blood spots that were collected off of plants, off dirt, around a campfire, just in a number of locations.
The one eyewitness, Jim Stevens, cooperated fully. His testimony would help the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement's Harry Capall reconstruct the killings.
We took, the next day I believe it was, we took Stevens and went back down to the crime scene and had him walk us through, showing us where Elms was standing, where Pogue was standing, where he was standing, where Dallas was positioned, and we acted it out and photographed it.
Investigators were sure of what had happened, but they didn't know where Claude Dallas was or where he had hidden Bill Pogue's body. Local and state officers and civilian volunteers would look for the body. The news of the warden's murders galvanized the searchers. Most of them knew the two wardens and their families. Sheriff Gary Amon, then a dispatcher, was part of the search for the body.
It was Dallas being a cold-blooded cop killer. It was scary searching, but there was anger there that you wanted to help the family find the body so they could bury their loved one.
Many of the searchers knew the 30-square-mile wilderness that they'd be scouring. But there were dozens of abandoned mine shafts and gullies in which to hide a body. And Claude Dallas knew them all.
All right, let's move it. We're burning daylight.
They would use high technology like infrared scanners. But most importantly, they would rely on their own patience and dedication.
They were very long days. They were cold days. We walked, we rode horses, flew in airplanes, flew in helicopters.
The FBI's manhunt team was charged with finding Dallas. The trapper could be anywhere. He was said to know every cave and gopher hole in the area where Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada meet. So the FBI wasted no time in blanketing the region with agents.
A specialized FBI force arrived in Winnemucca this morning, 12 members of the Bureau SWAT team out of San Francisco. They'll be evaluating and following up leads from several areas.
There were about 100 officers, including SWAT teams from California, Idaho, and Nevada. It was a posse ready for anything, because no one knew what the dangerous woodsman might do. While Special Agent Frank Nanzel coordinated the Nevada search, Special Agent George Calley of the Boise Field Office became the FBI's lead investigator.
The stories out on Claude Dallas early on seemed to be that he was a loner. He was one who was not too close to other people. He was a person who could live all by himself, could go off in the mountains and be totally independent.
Dallas projected the image of a storybook mountain man to those around him. It was a tale years in the making. Dallas was born on March 11, 1950, in Winchester, Virginia, the second son in a family of 9. When he was just a boy, his father taught him to hunt and lay a trap line, and that game laws didn't apply to them. The FBI learned that Dallas's name was already in their files for a draft-dodging charge more than 10 years earlier. When he was 18, he had registered for the draft as required by law, then left his family and hitchhiked to California. Dallas found work as a ranch hand, though he had no experience. But he learned fast and soon became known for his hard work and for his distrust of the law. After several years, he moved on, perhaps unaware the FBI wanted him as a draft dodger. In 1973, the FBI caught up with Claude Dallas. They arrested him for failure to report for induction. But the draft board couldn't prove he had ever received his draft notices. They dropped the charges. It was his first victory over the government laws he despised. Dallas moved to Paradise Hill, Nevada. He decided to trade ranch work for the life of a trapper. He wanted to be completely independent. Before long, Dallas was making his living solely as a trapper in the Nevada wilds. Although he was licensed, his traps often violated state game laws for illegal bait. Legitimate trappers had little respect for his operation. Sheriff Nettleton knew Dallas's reputation.
Dallas was a trash trapper. He never took the time to go with a real trapper and learn how to trap.
As authorities investigated the man they were hunting for alleged murder, they uncovered a history of conflict with the law. In 1976, Nevada game warden Dale Elliott came across some of Dallas's illegally baited traps. Dallas used birds and animal parts to lure bobcats, whose skins brought a good price. But this improper bait also attracts animals like raccoons and skunks and kills them needlessly. Elliott confiscated the traps and fined Dallas $100. 2 years later, in 1978, another game warden, Gene Weller, came across more traps in Dallas's territory. They were illegally baited with chunks of meat and had no tags. Dallas couldn't be found, and since it was late, Weller decided to return the next day to look for him. The following morning, Weller and a sheriff's deputy found Dallas's Jeep. But again, Dallas couldn't be located. Inside the Jeep, they found two weapons, a rifle and a revolver. It was against Nevada law to keep a loaded rifle in a vehicle, so they confiscated it. They took the revolver, too. Two loaded weapons in a possibly abandoned vehicle presented a dangerous situation. Anyone wandering nearby could take the firearms. The officers left a note for Dallas explaining where the guns would be held.
Name's Claude Dallas, here to get my guns.
3 days later, a disgruntled Claude Dallas arrived at the sheriff's office in Winnemucca, Nevada to claim his guns. They were now unloaded, and Dallas argued that the shells that had been inside were spent. The deputies couldn't produce evidence that the guns had held live rounds. The weapons were returned, and no fine was issued. It was another Dallas victory. Claude Dallas was a man who rejected the rules of society. But if his rules allowed for murder, the FBI had to bring him in. Within days of the two game wardens' deaths, FBI agents gathered information about the killer Claude Dallas. Special Agent George Calley led the investigation.
We realized that to find Claude Dallas, we had to learn more about him.
The FBI talked with local trappers and ranchers. Many were reluctant to help. The information on Dallas came slowly. As it did, the FBI pieced together the days leading up to the killing of the two game wardens. In December of 1980, a month before the killing of the wardens, Dallas had made a winter camp in the remote stretch of wilderness in Idaho's southwest corner. He would spend the winter trapping alone, but for a few visits from friends like Jim Stevens, who promised to bring mail and supplies. He chose Bull Basin for his camp. It was perfect for him. Wild, isolated country rich in deer and bobcat. A place where a man could live by his own rules. Dallas's closest neighbors were miles away. He knew other trappers sometimes worked Bull Basin, but he figured he could avoid them and the state's fish and game laws. But one day his neighbor paid him a visit. Eddie Carlin owned the 45 Ranch, 12 miles away. He often trapped in Bull Basin, and he wanted to know who was working his territory. Carlin saw illegal bobcat furs in the camp. When he commented on them, Dallas said he didn't believe in man-made laws. Something about the trapper made Carlin uneasy.
Well, I got a long line out here. I run 40 traps.
He nervously eyed Dallas's .357, a more powerful weapon than a trapper needs. Carlin made it clear his family had trapped in Bull Basin for years. Finally, they agreed to work separate areas of the basin.
I keep my property line squared away there. Okay.
They would stay off each other's turf. For the moment, Eddie Carlin was more concerned about a couple of trappers poaching on his 45 Ranch itself. In the Northwest, working another man's land is like stealing directly out of his pockets. Carlin drove 2 hours to the nearest phone to alert the Fish and Game Department. It was 10 p.m. on January 4th when Carlin reached Game Warden Bill Pogue. Pogue was known as a strict, by-the-books warden. Carlin knew he would help him clear his ranch of unwanted trappers.
All right, look, I'll see you in the morning.
Pogue understood Carlin's concern.
That would be great.
The poachers needed to be caught before they moved on to new territory. Pogue told Carlin he'd head out right away, but he needed to find a partner. He called 2 wardens who were unable to make the trip. Finally, he reached Conley Elms.
Yeah, Elms.
It was late, but when Elms heard the problem, he immediately agreed to go. The wardens arrived at the Carlins' 45 Ranch at 3 a.m. on January 5th. After a few hours' rest in sleeping bags outside, the men joined Eddie and Joanne Carlin for breakfast. Eddie described the poachers who were trapping on his land. The wardens considered how to approach them. Then Joanne added that there was another man named Claude Dallas trapping in Bull Basin. He was bagging game out of season. Eddie told them to watch out for Dallas. The wardens said they'd cover each other. They left to confront the trappers on the 45 Ranch first. Jim Stevens arrived in Dallas's camp at mid-morning, then went off to look for artifacts, leaving Dallas alone. The wardens entered the camp to check on the possible trapping violations.
Claude Dallas?
Yep.
Come out of the tent, please. Bill Pogue, Conley Elms, Game Wardens.
Dallas would later tell Stevens what happened next. The wardens asked Dallas for his gun. He surrendered one that the wardens had seen, but kept a second .357 pistol hidden.
40-mile trap line goes down into Nevada. I've got a license. Let me see your licenses.
Dallas said the argument began after the wardens checked his trapping licenses. They asked about the pelts he had hanging up.
What's in the tent?
Pogue pressed Dallas about the bobcat furs, and Dallas's anger rose.
What about these pelts? These pelts came from here.
No, these are.
Hey, sir.
The tension quickly escalated,
You got a warrant?
He doesn't need a warrant.
This
Step
is
back.
my home.
Step back.
and in an instant, Dallas's temper turned deadly.
What you shooting for?
Perhaps what was most horrible was the way the wardens were executed.
Oh.
Sheriff Nettleton understood the implication of the shots to the head.
That shot behind the ear was to finish him off, and is a common way of administering death by a trapper.
Clearly, Dallas considered the wardens no more than animals stumbling into one of his traps. The cold, terrible nature of the crime didn't faze Dallas. Unshaken, he tried to cover his tracks, intimidating Jim Stevens into assisting him. Then he vanished. Within 48 hours, the hunt for Bill Pogue's body by local volunteers had begun.
Team number 2 in this direction. Team number 3 off in this direction.
Elm's body had been found, and the story Jim Stevens recounted was proving to be true. The other warden was still missing. Local and state authorities used every tool at their disposal, including Sheriff Nettleton's airplane. The aerial search allowed for initial sweeps of large areas to be conducted quickly. It was necessary in such a vast expanse of territory. Freshly dug earth or other signs of Claude Dallas's actions may have been visible from the air. But finding a body would require a slow, careful ground search too, by a team that included Sheriff Gary Amon.
When we actually went down and searched for the body, approximately 50 or so people went down. We camped out near Paradise Valley, and we would break up into teams and we'd go search a specific designated area that we were assigned to, and we would basically turn over every rock and look under every brush for signs of a grave or footprints, bodies, whatever, any evidence that might be related to this case.
As local authorities searched for Pogue's body, the FBI hunted Claude Dallas. He could be anywhere, from the Northwest to Mexico or beyond. Dallas was on his own turf, and the manhunt promised to be long and frustrating. Agent George Kelly and the other investigators knew that to find Dallas, they'd have to narrow the search.
We had to contact the people that he had seen in the past, and we began to get an idea of the type of person he would look up by those who had similar interests that he did. And we really concentrated on who are his friends.
Investigators knew Dallas had friends in Paradise Hill, Nevada, so they focused there, checking homes, barns, and other buildings. Agents learned Dallas kept many of his belongings in a converted trailer behind George Nielsen's barn. When agents searched it, they discovered nearly 20 weapons and some combat training manuals. It was further evidence they were hunting a man who was dangerous and knew how to kill. Inside Nielsen's bar, the FBI questioned everyone who knew Dallas. The Nielsens were helpful, telling the FBI the same information they had given the county prosecutor earlier. But others in the bar were largely uncooperative. Not many locals appreciated federal intervention. They gave agents few leads. It was clear people were protecting Dallas, either because they liked him or because they disliked the law. The federal agents weren't the only ones getting the brush off. Even local authorities like Harry Capal felt the frustration.
Some of the anti-establishment type people said the two officers deserved to be killed. They had no business being down invading this man's camp, but there were quite a few people in the Winnemucca area who really weren't too helpful, and I think our investigation would have proceeded a lot faster and quicker had they have been more willing to come forward, or if we did interview them, tell us the truth.
The fact that Dallas had a network of supporters in Nevada and Idaho gave agents the first glimpse behind his mountain man facade. It seemed he was not the self-sufficient loner some made him out to be. He was resourceful, but he was also dependent on others. The field work by agents like Frank Menzel slowly uncovered the truth about Claude Dallas.
He wasn't earning any money, so he had to have some way to eat and sleep and that sort of thing, or a place to go to hide. So he was able to avoid us because he did have some friends not only in the state of Nevada, but Northern California, where he had relatives.
As investigators learned how Dallas operated, they figured out how to bring him out of hiding. They'd make the reclusive backwoodsman the best recognized man in the West, so he'd have to come home to hide. They designed and distributed a wanted poster and put a $20,000 reward on Dallas's head. Sheriff Nettleton called it the Poster War.
I had requests from so many police agencies, all the way from Alaska, all up and down the West Coast. They were in Field and Stream. Virtually every gun shop west of the Mississippi had one hanging up. And any place that Mr. Dallas went, he would see his face. Any of his haunts, any of his friends would see it.
This would leave him only one place to hide, back in Paradise Hill, where most of his supporters were. Investigators kept the pressure on, following every lead, searching every day, and waiting for Dallas to resurface. After 15 months, agents noticed the people of Paradise Hill becoming uneasy. They acted nervous when any law officer was nearby. The agents worked their contacts and learned that Claude Dallas was coming back to town. FBI agents persuaded a friend of Dallas's to turn informant and notify them when Dallas actually returned. In April of 1982, the informant came in to talk. He didn't want any trouble. Claude Dallas had moved in with a friend, he said. He was at Craig Carver's trailer just outside of Paradise Hill. There were plenty of weapons in the trailer. Within 12 hours, the arrest team had assembled and was ready to raid Carver's trailer. They had to act fast. There was no room for error. On Sunday, April 18, 1982, the FBI made their move on Claude Dallas. They descended upon his quiet, remote hiding spot. With air and ground support, the SWAT team quickly positioned themselves for the raid. They knew Dallas was an expert marksman and that he would be heavily armed. Special Agent George Callett was at the raid.
And I well recall the announcement that this is the FBI, and Claude Dallas come out, words to this effect. And he did, he came out.
But not the way they expected. Dallas dived through the window of the trailer and went to a truck. Agents were momentarily helpless to stop him. The arrest team mobilized and the chase was on. The FBI had spent more than a year tracking the cop killer. They could not let him get away. Cruisers and the helicopter stayed on his tail despite the danger. Dallas was shooting from his truck as he sped along. Agents and officers returned fire as they chased him. He seemed unstoppable, even bulletproof. But then his luck ran out. His truck stopped dead. The shooting stopped too. Dallas had been shot. He slipped out of his truck and crawled away. Men on the ground couldn't see him through the tall brush, but from the air, Nenzel had a bird's eye view. Unfortunately, with the agents out of their vehicle, he had no means of radio contact with them. So he was helpless to warn them.
When I saw that agent walking toward Dallas, this agent was a very highly trained special agent SWAT team leader named Dave Gillen out of Las Vegas. I didn't think he saw Dallas, and I thought there could be, I thought Dallas could have killed him right there. And it really scared me badly.
But as the agents approached, to everyone's surprise, Dallas lifted his arms and gave up. He was transported to a nearby hospital for treatment. The FBI had their man. Frank Nanzel breathed a sigh of relief.
Dallas told us he could have killed the agent that was walking toward him. And I said, thanks for not killing him.
With Claude Dallas secure behind bars, prosecutors began to build their case against him.
This morning, investigators went through Dallas's belongings looking for evidence to help in prosecuting him. Items searched included traps, pelt stretch boards, clothing, and 8 guns.
I believe there is a possibility that we could have the homicide weapon, but we don't know.
How many weapons are you looking for?
We're looking for one particular weapon.
But you're specifically looking for the gun that Claude used to shoot?
We're hoping it might be in this bunch.
At the Idaho State Forensics Lab, examiners tested the weapons confiscated from Dallas's trailer. They hoped to find the guns used to execute the wardens. But the tests were inconclusive. Prosecutors would have to rely on other forensic evidence and the testimony of Jim Stevens to earn a conviction. When Claude Dallas was released from the hospital, he was booked at the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, then flown back to Winnemucca, Nevada.
When they had Dallas in custody and got back to the airport in Winnemucca, it was just a feeling of relief. Hey, it's over with. Now let's get him tried.
Authorities were taking no chances. Security at the Owyhee County Courthouse was bolstered for Dallas's arrival.
From the first day of the trial, the courthouse was jammed with spectators, split into pro and anti-Dallas camps. His most vocal advocates were the so-called Dallas cheerleaders.
During the trial, there was a group, mostly ladies, that were openly antagonistic towards any law enforcement, that thought Mr. Dallas was cute and being railroaded. Didn't mind telling anybody that we had no business prosecuting him.
The prosecution expected an easy conviction on first-degree murder charges. They had a witness to the crime, forensic evidence, and a defendant who eluded capture for over a year. But it wouldn't be easy. Whether it was the strong defense or Dallas's charisma, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury reached a shocking verdict. Instead of the maximum charge of first-degree murder, they found Claude Dallas guilty of 2 lesser charges of voluntary manslaughter. If the jury was beguiled by Dallas, the judge was not. He gave Dallas the maximum sentences he could, a total of 30 years. During the trial, Dallas finally gave up the location of Bill Pogue's body. This provided some relief to the people who had searched the wilderness for months. Still, many felt justice had not been done.
We were shocked that Dallas got away with this because he had cold-bloodedly murdered 2 very fine Idaho officers, and not only murdered them, but shot them in the back of the head like they were just animals that he caught in a trap. And I thought that it was the worst decision. There was no justice. I felt bad for law enforcement, but I really felt bad for Pogue and Elm's family. I thought that was just tragic.
Bill Pogue's body was recovered from a shallow grave about 15 miles southwest of Paradise Hill, Nevada. And Claude Dallas began serving his time at the Idaho State Penitentiary. But the ordeal was not over. After 3 years in captivity, on Easter Sunday, 1986, he once again became a fugitive. Agents believed a woman from Reno who had befriended him brought him wire cutters on a visit. He used them to cut through the prison fence. It seems she also provided the getaway car. Dallas was now an escaped killer, and the manhunt team responded with full force. The FBI placed him on their list of 10 most wanted fugitives at the request of Special Agent George Calley.
We knew could be difficulty in finding him, that should get him on the top 10. Knew that getting this publicity, not only nationwide but worldwide, and our wanted flyers that go out.
Special Agent Nenzel welcomed the top 10 listing.
You have the backing of the entire FBI, more so than you would in just a regular case. I mean, we have all the equipment, helicopters, planes, technical advice, laboratory, SWAT teams, people that are able to do all kinds of things will help you on a solid lead on an FBI top 10 fugitive case.
The media also turned more attention to the case, generating more leads. The search was off to a strong start. Hopes were high when agents quickly located the car allegedly used in the escape. Forensics examiners processed it for prints. It may lead them to the escapee. But he had left no trace of himself. A few months after Dallas's escape, agents had a hot tip on his whereabouts. He was hiding in the small mining town of Eureka, Nevada. Under cover of darkness, Vegas and Reno SWAT teams arrived for the raid. They threw a device called a flashbang through the front door to stun anyone inside and send up a smoke screen to cover agents when they entered. Would the fugitive Claude Dallas finally be brought to justice? SWAT team members searched the house for Claude Dallas, but he had slipped away again. Maybe the agents had been in the small town too long and word had gotten out. In any case, Dallas was gone. It would be several more months before agents got their best break, almost a year after his escape from prison. They had been following another of his friends, Danny Martinez, who lived in the ranching community of Riverside, California. Martinez had a friend who looked a lot like Dallas, and he talked the friend into giving Dallas his ID. The friend was uncomfortable with the arrangement.
This guy just came to
He
my
called the
door
FBI and agreed to
and
help
pulled me
them.
out of my ID.
Meanwhile, Dallas fled to Mexico using the ID. He cut his hair, shaved his beard, and got a nose job. He had a new look, but he hadn't changed his pattern. As before, he returned to where his friends were, as agents predicted. When Claude Dallas returned to Riverside, Martinez had the informant take Dallas to a motel. The friend quickly alerted the FBI. Knowing Dallas was inside, a SWAT team assembled at the convenience store across from the motel. He was surrounded and he was unarmed, so he could not fight back this time. Claude Dallas was once again in custody.
Anyone will be appointed for you.
He was transported back to Idaho to stand trial. The charge was escaping from a state penitentiary. It seemed certain he would be found guilty. But again, he worked his magic on the witness stand. He claimed prison officials had concocted an elaborate scheme to kill him because they saw him as a cop killer. Amazingly, the jury bought his story, baffling agents like Frank Nenzel.
Dallas was acquitted from escape, which totally astounded every FBI agent I ever knew that worked on this case, or any agent that ever heard about this case. It just was beyond belief that Dallas could escape from prison and then go to trial for that and be acquitted.
Claude Dallas, who admitted killing 2 law officers, seemed somehow charmed when it came to prosecution.
By this time, he had got off of his draft dodging. He got off of shooting 2 officers. Now he gets off of escape because the authorities are mean to this poor little boy. That's been his defense every time.
But Dallas was defeated. He lost the year reduction in his sentence he had earned for good behavior, and he was returned to prison to serve the remaining 27 years of his term. Sheriff Gary Amon saw through Dallas's false image.
Claude Dallas to me was a wannabe cowboy loner that wasn't near as tough as he thought he was.
Harry Capall agrees.
I don't think ever earned the right to be called a mountain man or a trapper. He was nothing more than a thief and a murderer.
Following the game wardens' deaths, their widows initiated the construction of a memorial to Idaho's fallen officers. The monument stands as a testimonial to the true heroes of the West, those men and women sworn to uphold and protect the law. For 30 years, Vincent Gigante wandered the streets of New York's Greenwich Village, dressed in a tattered bathrobe and babbling endlessly to himself. To the FBI, he was believed to be the boss of New York's most powerful mafia organization, the Genovese crime family. Was Gigante crazy, or was his behavior a shrewd attempt to disguise his position as a ruthless mafia boss? That question would take years to answer.
Every family has eccentrics, even crime families. Crime boss Vincent Gigante, head of New York's Genovese family, was undoubtedly eccentric. The question remained, was he truly mad? Justice rested on the answer. Outwardly, he roamed the streets as a doggedly old man, barely in touch with reality. But in the eyes of the law, he was a cunning conspirator and responsible for murder. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Organized crime takes a concerted effort to crack. The FBI is devoted to cracking it. The case against Gigante hinged on his ability to stand trial. Was his strange behavior an act of madness or a stroke of genius?
Anyone who witnessed Gigante's ravings would have found it hard to believe that he controlled the largest and most profitable family in the New York Mafia, an organization with a long and bloody history. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to 13th century feudal Sicilian society. Bands of Sicilian families organized themselves to rebel against the oppressive and ruthless French invaders. Mafia, the acronym for the Italian Morta alla Francia Italia Anela, which translates to death to the French is Italy's cry. became the name that these organized families used to refer to themselves, its meaning synonymous with men of honor. By the 19th century, the mafia re-emerged in Sicily as a purely criminal culture, mostly hiring themselves out to wealthy landowners to oppress upstart peasants. More and more, the goal of the mafia became focused on how to generate illegal profits. The tradition continued as waves of Italians emigrated to New York in the 1920s. Most immigrants lived in cramped and poor conditions. As a result of growing ethnic tensions, Sicilian Americans became the target of growing resentment. They needed mafia protection more and more. Louis Scilero, a third-generation Italian-American, is head of the FBI's New York field office. A 23-year veteran, he is an expert on the mafia and its intricate structure.
When they first became prevalent in New York City, it primarily victimized members of the immigrant community, where in lower Manhattan they became the victims of extortions and protection rackets. And that's how the Cosa Nostra families originally got their start.
With Prohibition, influence of the crime families grew out from the isolated neighborhoods and began to spread nationwide. A new form of underworld cooperation emerged. Various crime families across America banded together to supply illegal alcohol to a country willing to pay for it.
And I think that probably more than anything gave the Italian gangs, the Italian Cosa Nostra families, a foothold in American society, not only from an organizational standpoint, but certainly from a financial base. Since Prohibition, certainly they then expanded into other areas.
Operating outside the law meant the mafia had to police itself. For an organization animated by self-interest and greed, there would always be conflict and opposition. An elite group of killers were organized to enforce mafia rules, thereby ensuring its survival. This group of mob enforcers came to be known as Murder, Inc. By the early 1940s, Murder, Inc. would be responsible for hundreds of mob-related murders nationwide. The powerful New York bosses during the mafia's early years, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, set up a ruling body for the mafia, responsible for delegating territories and duties among the various gangs nationwide. Home for America's 5 largest families, New York remained the center of the mafia's expanding foothold in America. It remains so to this day.
The 5 New York families consist currently of the Gambino family, the Bonanno, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Genovese family. Each of those families are also members of the Commission and also have their base in New York City.
The Commission, composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families, acts as a criminal board of directors, settling disputes between families and making major decisions on mafia business. Each family is governed by its administration, comprised of the boss, the underboss, and the consigliere, or counselor, who are responsible for directing their family's criminal activity. Below the administration in the family hierarchy are the captains. The captains are the leaders of crews of soldiers, the men responsible for carrying out the day-to-day criminal activity. To become a soldier, properly known as a wise guy or good fella, an individual has to first be made or officially inducted into the secret society. He must blindly obey the rules of Cosa Nostra, Italian for this thing of ours. He is sworn to put the family ahead of all else. If he is asked to kill, he must faithfully do so. It was against this backdrop, a bustling immigrant community with an expanding Cosa Nostra influence, that Vincent Gigante grew up. His parents came from Naples and settled in Lower Manhattan. Vincent finished 8th grade and started trade school, but soon dropped out. Less than a decade later, Gigante became a wise guy in the Genovese crime family. Vincent Gigante's crime career spanned a turbulent time in American mafia history. The mob had expanded its reach into legitimate businesses, the various families fighting to control them. And in the ensuing turf wars, violence was often the final arbiter. The family that Gigante attached himself to was steeped in Cosa Nostra's American origins. The infamous Charles Lucky Luciano, responsible for organizing and structuring the American Mafia, was the family's first boss until he was imprisoned in 1936. As a result, Luciano's family administration, Frank Costello, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Vito Genovese, fought for control of the family. Costello won out, but Vito Genovese began plotting his takeover. A young Vincent Gigante first gained notoriety as a mobster in 1957 when he attempted to murder Frank Costello. Within the Mafia, it was widely believed that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit to get rid of his rival. Gigante's bullet only grazed Costello's head, but apparently Costello got the message. Soon after the shooting, he put out word that he was retiring. Vito Genovese was now the boss of the family that would take his name. Gigante was arrested for attempted murder and brought to trial, but the case was dismissed for lack of a witness. The location and angle of Costello's wound indicated he probably saw the would-be assassin, but at the trial, he failed to identify Gigante as the shooter. Even for an ousted boss, the oath of secrecy remained sacred. Gigante continued to make money for the Genovese family through illegal enterprises. 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, he was arrested and convicted of narcotics violations. He received a 7-year sentence. Convicted mobsters are expected to do their time and remain silent. If Gigante served his time and kept his mouth shut, he would be rewarded after his release. It was up to Gigante to figure out how to avoid future arrests. He was a model prisoner, neat, polite, and willing to take on any job. Gigante's cooperation was so impressive that some prison officials wrote glowing reports. He was released early from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg for good behavior when he was 35 years old. Gigante now devised a secret plan that he hoped would prevent his return to prison forever. He didn't want to leave his mafia life or give up his shot at becoming the boss of the family. After his release in 1964, Gigante's public behavior began to grow bizarre. He became a frequent sight on the streets of Greenwich Village. Gigante could be found wandering the neighborhood, appearing disoriented and mentally unstable. Not long after he left prison, Gigante learned of a police investigation over his association with known mobsters. In 1969, he was indicted for attempting to bribe New Jersey police officers. Allegedly, he offered them money in exchange for information about surveillance and ongoing investigations in the Genovese family. Now, at almost 40 years old, he returned to his mental disability as a foil and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for the first time. To support his story, Gigante and his relatives began to revise his medical history. While Gigante was at Lewisburg, his mother had been required to fill out a detailed family history. She said Vincent was a healthy, happy child. She noted only a speech impediment and a slight heart murmur. He had been a boxer, but never had a serious injury. By the time of the 1969 indictment, however, Gigante's lawyers claimed he was not competent to stand trial. His family suddenly remembered a host of mental problems. He'd been given to severe temper tantrums. He had a phobia for the dark. He had been truant from school. He was at one time obese and had learning problems. The incompetency argument worked. Gigante never stood trial for the 1969 bribery charges. That same year, Gigante's boss, Vito Genovese, died of heart failure while serving a prison sentence for narcotics trafficking. In the decade that followed, the Genovese family was so secretive that for law enforcement, it was difficult to tell exactly who the boss was. Even had the FBI been able to identify the Genovese family leadership, making a case against them was another story. Witnesses were hard to come by. Mobsters who violated the sacred oath faced certain death. The best the FBI could do was to go after individual crimes. There were no laws that focused on bringing down the entire criminal family. As Gigante was moving up in the family, the federal government was about to make the FBI's job a little easier. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influences and Corrupt Organization Act, better known as the RICO laws.
What the racketeering law allowed us to do was to look at the family as a criminal enterprise and to attack the family as a criminal act. That became much more effective if you look back from the mid-70s to the 80s in terms of actually indicting the entire family and the entire hierarchy of that family.
The RICO laws require that the government prove that mafia families are essentially criminal enterprises. They must show that the crimes committed by the boss and members of his family are committed to either expand the criminal enterprise or to increase a family member's position within that enterprise. To successfully bring down a family, the government has to prove that any one of several criminal acts, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder, has been committed. By 1979, now armed with federal legislation aimed directly at organized crime, the FBI had devoted teams to exclusively focus investigations on the 5 major families. The FBI's Genovese squad finally learned that Vincent Gigante was on a fast track with the family. Special Agent Richard Rudolph had been assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family.
Through informants and other law enforcement agencies were exchanging information, we became aware that Mr. Gigante was an individual with much respect in the Genovese crime family and operated out of an area in Lower Manhattan. Because he was an up-and-coming person with a lot of respect within the family, we began to do some surveillances of Mr. Gigante.
With the FBI continuing to build its arsenal against organized crime, Gigante's cat and mouse game intensified. He stepped up his public show of mental disorder. In the late 70s and into the 80s, he was admitted 5 more times for psychiatric treatment. The FBI continued to keep tabs on Gigante. Agents learned that he frequented the Triangle Social Club, a gathering place for Genovese crime figures.
He could be found there almost on a daily basis. He lived in the neighborhood. He was an individual that could be found there in the late afternoons and into the early hours of the morning, and people would come to see him as opposed to him going to see other people.
Though Gigante's association in the Genovese family seemed certain to investigators, Gigante's family and doctors continuously told investigators that he led a very narrow existence. They said his whole world was confined to the block where he lived and the church he attended with his mother. He was barely functional at home and could not care for himself, they said. But with every passing day, the FBI and New York police were seeing a very different Vincent Gigante. In the early 1980s, the Mafia in the Northeast went through a particularly tumultuous time with several killings. Internal disputes within the family resulted in a string of assassinations. The FBI suspected Gigante was responsible for these gangland executions, especially those intended as punishment for breaking Cosa Nostra rules. Gigante was known to be a traditionalist. He wanted the rules obeyed, and when they were broken, retribution was sure to follow. It started with the murder of Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Although Bruno's family was well outside New York, all families answered to the members of the commission. Gigante was upset because Bruno had been assassinated by his own men in a grab for control of the family. A Cosa Nostra rule had been violated. No one can kill a boss unless the commission sanctions it, and they seldom do. It was rumored that Gigante himself launched an investigation into Bruno's murder. Retribution was swift. Less than a month later, Tony Bananas Caponegro, identified as one of Bruno's assassins, was found dead. He had been shot 15 times and stabbed in the back. His body was stuffed in a trunk, and $20 bills were littered around his body, a clear message that he was killed for his greed. On the same day, another body was discovered. This time it was Fred Salerno, dead of gunshot wounds, dumped in a vacant lot. He too had allegedly participated in Bruno's murder. Phil Testa had taken Angelo Bruno's place as boss. His reign was short. Almost a year after Bruno's execution, Testa was blown up entering his own home. Another boss killed without the blessing of the commission. Another avenging act would follow. Rocco Marinucci was next, found dead with fireworks stuffed in his mouth. A gesture designed to show that he was killed for the way in which he had killed Testa. If the Cosa Nostra was to flourish, all of its members had to comply with its rules. There were no exceptions. Gigante was believed to have ordered the murder of one of his own crime family members. Genovese soldier Jerry Papa had murdered 2 Colombo family members without permission. As punishment for his unsanctioned act, he was brutally shot and killed by members of his own criminal family. Had Gigante become the enforcer for the Northeast Cosa Nostra? Informers within the mob told federal agents that all of these killings had been ordered by Gigante. But information given by admitted criminals is always a problem for potential juries. Criminals will say anything if their cooperation can be traded for a reduced prison sentence. The FBI needed more than the words of criminals looking for a deal. Gigante knew this, and he protected himself accordingly. It seemed that Gigante was now the boss. The FBI began a more focused surveillance effort on Gigante. They learned that the Genovese family had also infiltrated several of New York's major industries: the garment trade, trucking, garbage collection, airport cargo handling, and the city's seafood industry. Vincent Gigante was known on the streets as the Chin, an abbreviation of Cinzino, Little Vincent. Fearing FBI surveillance and wiretaps, family members were not allowed to speak his name. They were to refer to him with hand signals, touching their chins to communicate his nickname. Bringing down the Chin was going to take every bit of know-how that the FBI could muster. They were going to have to create their own luck. As a surveillance team member watched one day, a telling crack in the Chin's ruse appeared. The seemingly frail man was being helped across a busy street. When oncoming traffic threatened, he became suddenly animated, racing to safety. His helplessness somehow overtook him again on the other side. Clearly, there were 2 Gigantes, the mentally troubled one displayed to the public, and the determined boss of the Genovese administration. The FBI would soon learn of a third. Gigante's ex-wife and their 5 children lived in New Jersey while he maintained a relationship with his long-standing companion, Olympia Esposito. He usually called on her late at night, looking quite dapper before he was aware of the surveillance.
We learned that he frequently visited a townhouse which was located up on 77th Street and the east side of Manhattan, where we later learned that a common law, he was living with his common law wife, and he had been married previously, and this was his second family there at this residence.
Soon the FBI knew all of the Chin's hangouts. This gave surveillance teams an opportunity to observe Gigante without his knowledge. A major break came when NYPD Organized Crime Task Force member Detective Tom Bruno was able to snap photos of some of Gigante's activities.
In 1984, I was assigned to a joint organized crime task force. That task force consisted of FBI agents and New York City police officers, detectives, and we were assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family. Then the next step was to go to Sullivan Street, where Chin Gigante lived. His apartment was above a pet store, alleged pet store. And he also had a social club on the block. And when you'd go by the social club, you'd see numerous people that were in the photos. And you'd see them standing in front of, going inside, and then sometimes crossing the street, going to the pet store, which was where the Chin, we believe, met people. Pet store really never had any kind of business that we could see. It had a little cat box in the window, and basically that was it.
More and more, Gigante was seen acting normally when he was unaware he was being watched.
I see Chin Gigante and I see Andrew Gigante, which is his son, come out of his residence. And I'm just minding my business, walking up the block. Andrew leaves to get in his car, and Chin is standing on the corner, and he wasn't helped out of his building, and he was standing on the corner. Andrew gets in his car, pulls out. As he pulls out, there's a car coming up Sullivan Street. It blows the horn. Chin Gigante yells, "Hey, what are you, in a rush?" As he does this, I come into the lighted area. He looks, sees me, and all of a sudden his head goes down, and he plays the sick point.
Another break followed Detective Bruno's surveillance successes. The FBI managed to rent an apartment close to the townhouse of Gigante's companion, Ms. Esposito. An agent would exit through a back door in the rented apartment building and position himself about 50 feet from Ms. Esposito's townhouse. From there, Ms. Esposito and Gigante could be seen from time to time. An agent watched the couple for 4 months between midnight and 2 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Weissman, who later would have to prove Gigante's competency to stand trial, was delighted with the agent's observations.
And lo and behold, when he was inside in a place where he didn't think he was being observed, he did all of the normal things that any of us would do. As a matter of fact, what was unusual about those surveillances was that there was nothing unusual about him. He was normal. He was talking to people. He was counting money. He never wore a shoddy bathrobe. Indeed, the only time he was seen in a bathrobe was, not surprisingly, when he got out of the shower. He would wear a nice, fluffy, Brooks Brothers type bathrobe, which was not at all like the bathrobe that he would wear when he was on the street. So it became pretty obvious to the people conducting the surveillance that he was engaging in a concerted effort to give an appearance to the public that was false, that was not the way he behaved in real life.
Investigators continued to watch Gigante's bizarre public behavior. But photos themselves are only a single link in proving criminal activity. Investigators needed hard evidence to corroborate what the photos were suggesting. That Gigante was in fact the boss. One wiretap conversation between Genovese crew members gave investigators more proof of Gigante's position in the family. On the tapes, known Genovese members were complaining about the chin. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Stamboulidis reviewed these tapes to help prepare a case against Gigante.
He's constantly nitpicking his men, trying to always, with a million questions, drilling them and questioning them on what they're involved in. He's always looking to get money from them, or money from some of the schemes and how he earned, and how much money he would make from the gambling operations at the Triangle Social Club and things like that.
While Gigante micromanaged the internal affairs of his family, the tabloids began calling him the Odd Father.
He would check himself in to a hospital once a year for what his colleagues in the mafia sarcastically referred to as tune-ups, so that he would have a paper trail showing that he had some, or giving the impression that he had some mental condition. And with the assistance of people around him and people in his family, he was able to cultivate this paper trail, giving the impression to anyone who looked at the cold medical records that here's someone who, year in, year out, was being treated for some form of mental illness.
Gigante knew how to protect himself, both publicly and privately.
Mr. Gigante was very clever in how he conducted business, and he limited his contacts with members of the family. If there were messages or items to be discussed regarding illegal activities conducted by the Genovese family, there would be messages passed on to people immediately surrounding him. Access to him was very limited. If the other family wanted to meet with him, more than likely they would have to send a message.
Gigante avoided the normal sit-downs or more formal meetings held regularly by other family bosses. He would take meetings when businesses demanded his attention. He and his visitors would stroll the sidewalks through the neighborhood, ensuring that surveillance wiretaps would not pick up any incriminating conversations. The always careful Gigante also suspected Ms. Esposito's phone was tapped, and it was. He never talked business on the phone. He would simply use a payphone or make arrangements to talk elsewhere. The FBI would not be able to use the Chin's own words to make a case against him. Other mobsters were not as smart. Sophisticated bugging operations were allowing the FBI to capture a multitude of other mob business on tape. In early 1985, the Justice Department was bearing down hard on a number of high-level organized crime figures. Most were being charged under the RICO Act. Though RICO had been around since the early 70s, it was only now receiving its first real test. Two of Gigante's men had gotten wind that the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families would soon be arrested. They wondered if the Chin was vulnerable. One commented that if he gets pinched, all those years in the asylum would be for nothing. On February 19th, the arrests of several crime family bosses were made. The next day, Vincent Gigante checked himself into the hospital and stayed a week. He had successfully avoided the indictment against the New York bosses. Among those arrested was Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors never brought him to trial. He was killed before they had the chance. By Cosa Nostra standards, the unsanctioned murders of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were unpardonable. Although John Gotti, a captain in the Gambino family, acted shocked at Castellano's death, it was widely believed that he was responsible. Within 2 weeks of the murders, Gotti had publicly taken over as boss. Vincent Gigante issued a subtle warning to Gotti. Without mentioning names, he told Gotti that the murderer would have to pay. It took 2 years, but in 1987, Gigante acted to avenge the murder of his friend and partner in mob business. Through his counselor, Bobby Manna, and some Lucchese family members, Gigante plotted to have Gotti killed. The planning session at a New Jersey restaurant was bugged, and because it was, the FBI saved John Gotti's life. If agents intercept information of a murder plot, they are required by law to try to prevent the killing. So based on the tape, agents warned Gotti. Acting on the FBI warning, John Gotti changed his plans on the day the murder was to take place. Because he was not where he was expected, the murder plot failed. Gigante, however, did not give up. He asked Vic Amuso, acting boss of the Lucchese family, to supervise another hit. It was up to Amuso and his men to work out the details.
And that was to have Amuso reach out to Al Diorco, one of his trusted men, just as Manna was one of Gigante's trusted men, and have Diorco use his contacts in other parts of the country to acquire a remote-controlled bomb.
But Gotti was arrested and imprisoned before the second plot could be carried out. He died of cancer while serving a life sentence for racketeering involving extortion and murder, including Castellanos. Meanwhile, the FBI had Chin's men on tape conspiring the murder. As the FBI's investigation into Genovese family operations continued, information about a corrupt construction scheme was coming to light. They learned that for years, much of the Genovese family income came from one segment of the construction industry, the window business. The family had managed to keep its hold on window replacement jobs for all of New York City's public housing projects.
We learned that at that time there was an enormous amount of money being put into refurbishing some of the New York City Housing Authority windows. There was an energy crisis underway, and the timing of this was ideal for the organized crime people to become more active in it. What we learned was that the Genovese family, along with 2 or 3 other families, were becoming involved in companies that were bidding and installing the windows in some of these housing projects. From the late 1970s up until the late 1980s, there was approximately $190 million worth of contracts given out by the city of New York for the window replacement industry.
It was classic mob business and a textbook example of racketeering. The mafia took over an industry to the exclusion of legitimate businesses. Union officials were corrupted. In this case, Iron Workers Local 580. Bids were rigged, and companies or workers trying to play by the rules lost out. For years, the Lucchese and Genovese families operated their construction schemes autonomously. By the early 80s, they realized that a partnership would be much more profitable. By this time, the Lucchese family had a firm hold on Local 580, and the Genovese family had corrupted several contractors. They cooperated because it meant more business.
By using the Local 580 as a tool, they were able to exclude several contractors from coming in and bidding on some of these projects, and in essence created a somewhat of a monopoly for themselves.
On nearly all City Housing Authority work, and on much of the new construction for the city, the Genovese contractors and installers paid $2 a window. $1 went to the Lucchese family, 25 cents to the collector, and 75 cents to the boss for the family's role in handling the union. The other $1 went to the crooked union officials who looked the other way as jobs went to non-union workers. Refusal to cooperate often carried a penalty of violence. In the late 80s, a carpenters union delegate had both of his legs broken by Genovese men for refusing to cooperate. though he maintained that he was unable to get a good look at his attackers. And in 1992, a delegate from Local 580 was shot and killed coming out of his house on Long Island over a disagreement with his Cosa Nostra contracts. The Lucchese and Genovese family arrangement was working very smoothly. That is, until Peter Savino was persuaded to wear a wire. Savino was a Genovese soldier and point man for the window racket.
We built a case on him, a murder case on him, and it was sufficiently compelling that he realized, like many of these people, that he didn't want to die in jail. So what did he do? He decided to cooperate. And for an 18-month period, made tape recordings of people in the Genovese family and people in the Lucchese family operating this scheme.
Vincent Gigante didn't realize Peter Savino was turning on him. He was happy with Savino's work and satisfied with the window scheme's progression. Savino kept track of the money. He managed the contracts. He supervised the bids. He arranged the payoffs. The boss was happy, but some Genovese family members began to suspect Savino. When bodies were found in the basement of a building he owned, Genovese members were surprised that he was never seriously investigated by law enforcement.
As a result of that, people speculated, well, Savino wasn't arrested, yet these bodies were found in a building that's tied to him. Maybe he's cooperating, but nobody was really sure.
Savino was a cash cow for Vincent Gigante. He was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Genovese family every month. So when Gigante was told of Savino's betrayal, he chose not to believe it and initially refused to order him killed. Savino continued to wear the wire, trying to get other family members to acknowledge Chin and his position as boss of the family. Gigante's troops, however, could never be persuaded to break the boss's rule about not mentioning his name.
Remember Uniseal? Vincent had said when it came time to bid. Oh, okay, I'll mention him. He had said to go out and bid the work.
It was, don't mention that name. How can you talk like that? That was pretty damning proof. Even though it didn't give you a specific crime, it told you that this was a man to be feared. It was hardly somebody who was incompetent.
Shortly thereafter, it came to Gigante's attention that Savino was in fact cooperating. Furious at this betrayal, Gigante ordered the murder of Peter Savino. By that time, the FBI had relocated Savino well out of Genovese family reach, but not before he supplied agents with thousands of hours of taped conversations.
Mr. Savino was also in a position to provide us with the historical aspects of how this scheme developed, his relationship with the leaders of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime family, and what their participation was in this thing. Mr. Savino also was able to tell us how the various members of all of these families interacted with Local 580, which was used, again, as the tool to make the scheme work.
The FBI was successfully employing the RICO laws to bring down New York's most powerful bosses. As a result, high-ranking family members saw that their only way to avoid long prison terms was to cooperate. Among them were Gambino family underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gigante was finally arrested and charged under the RICO laws with ordering 6 people murdered, conspiring to kill 3 others, and at least 24 counts of racketeering. In short, Gigante was charged with being the boss of the Genovese crime family. But Gigante still had his mental illness history to fall back on.
Mr. Gigante was indicted in May of 1990, and a second indictment was filed against him in June of 1993. The case against Mr. Gigante was unusual, that it spanned several years before it actually went to trial. He eventually went to trial in June of 1997. During that period of time, the issue that was before the courts was that whether he was competent to stand trial or not. That issue was finally resolved in 1996.
7 years after his arrest, a federal district judge declared Vincent Gigante competent to stand trial. Vincent the Chin Gigante was 69 years old when a jury convicted him of conspiring to kill 3 mafia figures, including Gotti and Savino. He was also found guilty of extortion and union payoff conspiracies in the window replacement scheme. But jurors failed to convict him on charges of directly ordering 6 murders. Now that Gigante was convicted, his defense lawyers argued that he was not fit to be sentenced. They claimed he was too old, too frail, and too mentally incompetent to understand the punishment. While awaiting sentencing, Gigante was confined to a prison hospital and examined by several doctors. Gigante was given several PET scans, a procedure that uses a radioactive tracer to measure brain chemistry. A 1991 scan, first read as normal, was later found to be too flawed to use in diagnosis. A 1993 scan did show some abnormalities. But at least one expert, Dr. Jonathan Brody, judged these abnormalities as not consistent with dementia. Dr. Brody is an attending psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital and a professor at New York University's School of Medicine. He also conducts research on schizophrenia.
Mr. Gigante, at the time of the scan, was purportedly taking medication that affects the brain. And because it affects the brain, it affects brain chemistry. And brain chemistry is what a PET scan is all about.
Gigante was taking an antipsychotic medication, and antidepressants, a low-potency tranquilizer, and sleeping pills. So Dr. Brody was skeptical about the PET scan, but had yet to examine the patient.
When the three of us entered the observation room, the examining room where he was then brought, I was struck at first by his appearance, which I said made me think, oh my God, he really is sick. I've missed the boat. He's really very sick. He came in wearing a bathrobe, he was shuffling, he was mumbling, he was making allusions to God.
But as the examination progressed, some of Gigante's actions began to raise doubts.
But one of the things that really struck me was that I didn't note at the time, but I noted a few seconds later, was when I put out my hand for him to shake it, he didn't shake it. And that's a very automatic behavior. You put your hand out, your worst enemy can put his hand out to you, and you tend to take it.
How about this way?
When Gigante was asked the names of his children, he didn't know. When he was asked where he lived, he didn't know.
And yet, these are things that people tend not to forget. You know, the brain in a dementia tends to work on the process of accounting. The last in, first out. So recent memory tends to be lost, but that's why people who are very demented can often remember very well events from long ago, even if they can't remember recent events. Well, he was not consistent on that. Indeed, he was asked the question about who the President of the United States was, which is a standard question on a psychiatric mental status evaluation. And he scratched his head and he looked perplexed and he said, I should know that. I should know that answer. It's in there somewhere. And some more questions were asked. He said, I really should know that. And then finally he said, Bush. George Bush. And I sat there and thought, Oh, he remembered the question. What was striking was not that the answer was incorrect. What was striking was that the question was remembered despite all of the interfering questions.
And there were other red flags. He seemed to understand abstract concepts. Dr. Brody asked Gigante if he was proud of his children.
Now, pride is really quite an abstract notion. And his response was, yes, they're all working. Legitimate jobs. Legitimacy? Well, that wasn't even a question. Legitimate implies yet something else, that he was able to abstract from the question some intent as to what the question was involved with, and awareness of a distinction between legitimacy and illegitimacy. And here was a man who didn't know what month it was. He didn't know if he was in a hospital.
These and other inconsistencies contributed to Dr. Brody's conclusion that Gigante did not suffer from progressive dementia, vascular dementia, or schizophrenia. Guards assigned to watch Gigante during his pre-sentencing hospitalization also found his behavior normal. They testified that he was active around his prison hospital cell and polite to the hospital staff. He did not need help to shower, to groom himself, or to feed himself.
The lawyers all put in affidavits that they couldn't communicate with Vincent Gigante at all. Well, when he was in jail, he managed to speak with the prison counselors. When you sort of talk to the sort of low-level people in jail who have to take care of inmates on a day-to-day basis, it turns out he knew exactly what had happened. He knew he had been on trial. He knew that Gravano had testified against him and didn't have very nice things to say about him. He knew that his sentencing was upcoming. He knew what the issue was before Judge Weinstein as to that he had to decide that he was competent to be sentenced. It was completely at odds with what his lawyers were telling Judge Weinstein.
Some psychiatrists thought Gigante really was incompetent. Others thought he was faking. 5 months and dozens of tests later, the judge ruled. The judge said, in short, the defendant's cognitive and emotional capacity and his communication skills are equivalent to other 69-year-old defendants with limited education. No hallucinations interfere with his abilities to participate in sentencing. He understands the fundamentals of criminal substantive law and procedure. He is deliberately feigning mental illness to avoid punishment which he fears. Defendant is competent to be sentenced and to serve an appropriate term in prison. Shaliro described efforts of the FBI and prosecutors as historic and courageous.
This has been a battle that certainly I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and certainly I think agents that will continue that on over the next 5 or 6 years. If the effort could be sustained and the resources maintained, I think we're on the verge of really reducing the effects and the impact of the Cosa Nostra.
To be sure, the government's legal victory in the Gigante case was partial. The jury, after all, failed to convict him of the 6 murder charges. He was originally sentenced to 12 years. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and earned 3 more years, finally admitting in court that he had been faking insanity the entire time.
Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches, and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide, and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. We're on the Isle of Man in today's Murder by the Sea, where in 1991, Corinne Bentley thought she was heading to a job interview. The interview was fake and she ended up dead, in a very rare case for the island.
The Isle of Man's a relatively small, rocky outcrop, just 32 miles long by 14 miles wide, in the middle of the north parts of the Irish Sea off the west coast of Britain. It has, for hundreds of years, been a holiday resort for people seeking quiet walks in what is genuinely a beautiful, spectacular location.
It's a lovely place to live, a lovely place to bring your children up. And as far as the police force is concerned, although it's an island and you don't have the sort of the major crime related to drugs and that sort of stuff in those days that you had with the UK, there was still a lot going on, and it was interesting. Douglas is capital of the island. The island's now got about 85,000 people, and about half of that population live in or around the greater Douglas area. There's no areas where you wouldn't want to walk and not feel safe.
In essence, if you had a burglary, you had a pretty good idea who would have done it, because we had a small community of criminals. It's the nature of the beast, isn't it? You'll always get the vast majority of people law-abiding. There's one or two that will always want to do it easier, do it the simple way, and would commit the crime.
There were a number of homicides, there were a number of violent crimes in the Isle of Man in the mid-20th century, but I think this was a particularly unpleasant crime. The motives made it particularly unpleasant, the means made it particularly unpleasant, and the youth of the parties make it horrible as well. So I think it's fair to say it was a shocking crime at the time.
Now, the Isle of Man is a curiosity. It's one of 3 crown dependencies of Great Britain, and it maintains the right to govern itself. And it retains its own set of judicial procedures and laws. They're known as Manx laws and procedures, which are separate from and often very different to those throughout the rest of Great Britain.
It's a small country, it has limited resources. If there's a good model of a law that England or Ireland or Canada or Australia has made, why don't you take that as your starting place? So actually, if you were visited the Isle of Man, and I would strongly encourage everyone to visit the Isle of Man, if you visited the Isle of Man, it would feel very, very familiar to you. The laws would feel very, very familiar, but their basis is actually different. So for instance, there is no national speed limit on the Isle of Man. There are many speed limits in towns and, where necessary for safety, and they are imposed by an Act of Tynwald, not by an Act of Parliament.
If you ask anyone in Britain the date of the last death sentence passed for murder in this country, they'll almost certainly point to the mid-1960s. And they would be right. Almost. The last 2 men to be hanged for murders were executed in 1964. And the following year, the death sentence was suspended in mainland Britain. And in fact, in 1969, capital punishment was abolished by Act of Parliament for all crimes except treason. But the key word in all of this is mainland Britain, because the Isle of Man retained it. And that death sentence was the only sentence available under Manx law in 1992 for cases of murder. And the last person to be condemned to death for murder in the British Isles was Tony Tier. His trials and punishment played out have guaranteed him a place in British legal history.
The murder of Corinne Bentley takes place on the Isle of Man in July of 1991. Corinne was a single woman, aged 22. She lived alone, and she'd started a relationship with a local farmer on the island. Now, Corinne is described as being having mental incapacity to a degree.
Corinne herself wasn't from the Isle of Man. She was born in the Littleborough area of Rochdale, and she was said to have some kind of intellectual impairment that meant her mental age was around 15. Despite that, she had had a job working for older people.
She had formed a relationship with a local man, Elliot Kinvig. Now, Mr. Kinvig owned a substantial farm on the Isle of Man. It was 111 acres.
Elliot lived on a farm with his mother, his sister, and her husband, his brother-in-law. The farm was quite extensive. It was 111 acres, in fact, in total. And they farmed the usual agricultural products, grew various crops, and had a small amount of livestock. But within a short period of time, there was a great deal of resentment, apparently, in relation to Corinne residing at the farm. Although it's not documented exactly why, but it must have involved the ownership of the farm and the financial setup and etc., what would happen in the future. So much so that the family demanded that Elliot evict Corinne from the farmhouse and have nothing more to do with her.
Corinne was an innocent. She was vulnerable. She was easy for people to pick on or to develop a dislike of, because they picked on that vulnerability. They felt she was weak. And you do get a sense with the Kinvigs wanting to get rid of her. There's a lack of sympathy for her, a lack of understanding, and this desire almost to be better than her, to be more powerful than her, to show her what her place should be. This kind of dismissal of her life is really quite appalling.
Elliot and Corinne's relationship was pretty strong, and he in fact threatened the family and stated that, on the contrary, that if anyone was going to be evicted, he would evict them, not Corinne, and that she would remain with him on the farm. The resentment grew apparently over a period of weeks, and so much so that his brother-in-law approached a local lad living on the island up in Ramsey, Tony Tier, as he was known.
Tony Tier, at the time of the murder, was in his early 20s. He was an electrician, I believe, working for the brother-in-law of Elliot Kinvig. Now, Elliot was Corinne's boyfriend.
In July 1991, Tony Tier was in severe financial difficulties. He had originally come to the Isle of Man several years earlier from his hometown of Runcorn, near Cheshire. And he had a job as an apprentice engineer, but he ran up debts. And in the summer of 1991, the bank with which he had an overdraft was demanding immediate repayment. Tony Tier had no money, had no way of paying back that overdraft.
The brother-in-law made it quite clear to Tier that the family wanted Corinne gone, and in fact was quite blunt about it and actually told Tier that they wanted her dead. Quite bizarrely, Tier agreed that he would murder Corinne for them for the sum of £600.
It seems like such an overreaction. You know, if you have somebody living in your house who you don't want there anymore, there are steps you can take to get them to move. You know, why hire a hitman to kill them? It's such an overreaction and kind of quite inexplicable.
Tia was careful to negotiate a fee for killing Corinne Bentley, a young woman he had never ever met. And the price for murdering a stranger was set at £600. A very low figure, so it seemed to Tia, and genuinely was a low figure. It's worth only about £1,200 today. But since he was in such financial difficulties, he realised he had very little leverage and agreed to the price.
He arranged for Corinne to meet him on some remote moorland on the pretext of some kind of job interview, which again is quite bizarre how he managed to get her out onto that type of location. But you must remember that apparently she had some sort of learning difficulties. Tia met with Corinne and brutally attacked her and actually cut her throat with what was described as a Stanley knife or a modelling knife. And then he ran from the scene, leaving her to bleed to death. Now, incredibly, Corinne managed to stagger approximately 350 yards in the direction of a remote farmhouse.
She has this wound to her throat. She can't shout, she can't scream for help, and instead she's stumbling towards the nearest building, which is another farmhouse. And you kind of read the account of what happened to her and kind of really wish that she'd got to this farmhouse, that she'd been able to communicate and find help. But instead then she has this awful bad luck of falling into an unused silage pit, and there she dies. Often with cases of murder, you know, the answer is close at home. So the police look at the family, the family's friends, and kind of anyone they came into contact with. You know, you look at people's financial backgrounds, who might be struggling for money, who might have a reason to kill somebody or be hired to kill somebody, and find out what was going on here, you know, what the feelings of the family towards Corinne were.
We had no suspect as such because we had no evidence that a crime had been committed. All we had was a 23-year-old single girl who hadn't been in touch for a couple of weeks. So although we were concerned about her welfare, there was no suggestion or any evidence that harm had come to her. In '91, I was uniform inspector and classed as a divisional commander in charge of policing in Douglas. I spent most of my service in CID, but then I got promoted into uniform and went in charge of Douglas Policing, which is how I became involved in the Corinne Bentley case. Obviously, I was aware that we had missing from home in relation to Corinne. A little bit more serious than normal because Corinne was a vulnerable young lady. She had learning difficulties, as we would say in these days. She was 23. And she hadn't been seen for a couple of weeks, and obviously that was worrying. So I went down to the CID and asked him would he put one of his experienced detectives on it in case somebody missed something, or somebody, you know, a witness often remembers things later. First of all, he goes to the boyfriend and ask him when did he last see her. Now, and he said he'd been the last time he saw Corinne he was with her, and a lad who he knows as Tony Tier stopped the car to speak to them. And Tony said to Corinne that he knew of somewhere that there was some work and he would take her there. Elliot didn't get in the car and Tony drove away with Corinne in the car. So that was one of the last positive sightings we had. Elliot, I think, also had a form of learning difficulty, but he came over quite genuine apparently, as did Tony Tier, because he said he'd had her in the car, give her a lift, he dropped her off. There was nothing to suggest anything untoward. And then there was another sighting, apparently, where somebody thought they saw her on a bus, after Tony Tier had given her a lift. So at that stage, and really, they were the only people that really knew her. So there wasn't a lot more that could be done. The advantage of now is, of course, we've got social media, so as soon as you've got somebody missing, you can post it all over the place. But we didn't have it in those days, so it wasn't that easy to circulate to everybody. I mean, we had local newspapers, but not everybody reads a paper. So that was unusual, but I wouldn't say it was totally rare that a young person would go missing. Once we'd interviewed all the people that we could interview, there wasn't a lot more that could be done. So you're basically hoping she's either going to turn up, or a boyfriend and that sort of thing might come up with some information, because there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that anything untoward had taken place. And bear in mind the history of the tension in the house and what went on in the house. A lot of that didn't come out until the trial itself, so we didn't have that information at the time that Kareem was missing. One of the DSs came up to me and said he'd got the file and he was going to have a look at it, so thanks very much. And then he said he'd arranged for Tony Tier to come in to the police station for another chat. And I was actually in the control room when he came in, and Dave took him down to the interview room, which is towards where the cell block area is. And Dave hadn't been gone 10 minutes, perhaps even only 5 minutes, and he come back and he had this sort of shocked expression on his face, and I said, "What's up, Dave?" He just said, "He's coughed murdering her." A coughed obviously is the police slang for admitting, and he's admitted killing her, and just like that. That then put a totally different complex on the inquiry. So then obviously he was then arrested on suspicion of murder, and then he got a lawyer, and then they took interviews, and it went from there. People confess to things they haven't done all the time. So following the interview with his lawyer, Tony agreed to take the police officers up to the scene where the attack took place. And when they got there, there was no sign of Kareem. But they did find an earring, and that was later identified as belonging to Kareem. So that was really the first main evidence that what Tony Tier was saying was correct. Because up to that stage, although we'd admitted to a murder, there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that had taken place. And then it was decided the next day, because it was late on in the afternoon, that they get some police officers together and search the area, which is what they did.
As constable, I joined as a constable, and I retiring as constable 29 years later. I was in a divisional officer. The island was split into 4 divisions at that stage: Douglas, West, South, North, and I was in now called Onken and Laxey, which is the outskirts of Douglas into just north of Douglas, Laxey village area, and the countryside surrounding area. As a force, we had a hill search team. It's a rural community, small island, and there's always a risk that someone would take a fall out in the countryside. I had an interest in it. I was involved in establishing the team and involved in the training side of things. Primary function was to go out and search for people if they got into difficulties or got lost or they were injured. Probably first recollection of it was the day we were told we were going out to search for her. We were aware that she'd been murdered. We had been called out the following day to do a search for her, because apparently it had been disclosed by Tier that he had murdered her or stabbed her, and they couldn't find her. So we were going to be called out en masse to look for her. We were aware there'd been an arrest. Obviously, word spreads for small force, 200 plus officers. Word spreads very fast. I was on duty. I can't remember my duty the day before, but I was on duty and had heard there had been an incident, and as later on we were told we were being called out as the team up to look for her. Area called Druidale Farm. There's a track down there. We went up on obviously transported up there. Incident room was there.
Druidale's not the place you frequent. You drive through it, but you don't go there unless you're going to a farm or something. The only buildings up there are farms, the odd farm building, but there's no and sheep, and basically that's it. It's very isolated, and the roads are very narrow up there. And it's not even a road that you would go to get from A to B. You only go through Drewdale either because it's a nice day and the scenery's lovely, or you're going to visit a farm there. You wouldn't drive through it to get from one place to another.
There was the hill search team, which I believe we were 10, 12 officers at that stage, but there was other uniformed officers there as well, and we were split into teams to search initially an area leading down to the farm and across the fields to look for Corinne and or any evidence relating to the incident. As with many roads on the Isle of Man, it's green. We have a lot of rain, so there's a deep gully to the side. Hedgerows there are gorse and brambles, so if you can hide someone, perfect location, the likelihood of being found quickly is remote. We started searching on the left-hand side of the track, and we did a sort of peripheral field. On the way, we searched one series of fields and turned to go across the bottom of the farm area, as it were, and we started coming back up through towards the farm and on the other side of the farm track. Part way up, there was a cesspit, the runoff from a slurry from the farm. Climbed up onto it, walked across, and I spotted what was, unfortunately, I spotted Corinne, and it was very obvious what I found, and I called it in on the radio at that stage, controlled the scene, and reported that unfortunately I'd found her. In the police, you're used to seeing things. I was surprised, shall we say, to find her, because looking for evidence, I wasn't expecting to find her. It's not the sort of thing that you want to find. Heartbroken for the girl and the family, obviously. It became a crime scene in essence. I called over the radio, aware that in those days the press were monitoring our radios. So I said, my recollection, something along the lines, I think I found what we're looking for, at which point the press descended on the incident room, so obviously confirmed they were senior officers came down, the scene was and I was left to secure the scene.
This is such an overreaction to what the situation was. You know, she's an innocent woman in her early 20s. You know, she hasn't got any kind of obvious enemies. She hasn't done anything that could have enraged anyone. Why would she be the target for such a horrific crime? Was a young man sort of doing a very ordinary job on the Isle of Man, where not much of any interest kind of happened, certainly not in his locality or in his life. You know, having been paid to kill Corinne, he then starts to play into this idea that he is a professional hitman. This is a kind of identity that is far more exciting and glamorous in his mind than what he actually does. So he's talking to the police as though he is this big character. It makes him feel like he's a success, you know, even though he was hired to pay off a few kind of debts and he had no real beef with Corinne.
There wasn't a lot of forensic evidence because of the fact that she'd been out there so long. Better when you're exposed to the weather, the heat, the cold, so it's very, very difficult. Forensic evidence like that is not easy. It's not easy at all. They bring a team in from the UK, just like any small force would, and they get it very quickly. So the scene would be preserved with tarpaulin and stuff like that, and then they bring a forensics pathologist from the UK.
In any case where a body is recovered in an inclement situation, so as an example in a silage pit, then that produces challenges to the investigation that need to be overcome. And of course, it could lead to the removal of forensic evidence. It was evident in this case that the victim had sustained a really severe neck injury, which was believed to have been caused by a bladed instrument, and had also sustained beating injuries. So there was very clear evidence that this was a brutal attack and murder. It's apparent from the bloodstaining that Corinne Bentley actually survived her injuries for a time because she was able to move or travel between the site of attack and where sadly she collapsed and died. Certainly in a case like this, when individuals are found in a ditch or a deposition site, then there's a natural sort of instinct to believe that this isn't where the attack took place. And so in this case, because she had been injured somewhere else and then moved and left this trail of blood drops, then that would allow the investigators to travel back and find the site of the attack. And then at that site there might be other information such as tyre marks and other forensic evidence that can help them to piece the attack together. In terms of forensic evidence, then there's always a potential for that evidence to be retained and preserved, even in the most inclement of scenarios. We recover DNA from individuals that have been in water bodies for decades, so there is always the potential that we'll recover material even in cases like this.
Another thing about this particular case is, of course, contract killings are quite unusual. They're not that common, obviously. And the other thing about it is, of course, the small amount of money that was offered and accepted for such a brutal crime. I mean, to cut a young woman's throat for £600, even in 1991, that's a pretty drastic thing to do. Does it tell you just how desperate Tia was to obtain money, perhaps? Or does it say a bit more about him, about the type of individual he was? He's 19 years of age, and yet here he is. He's a man who's quite prepared to cut a young woman's throat and murder her for an amount of money to pay off a debt. He was quite callous and cold in one manner, in a comment that he made to officers during his confession, that he felt that he did it for far too less a sum and that he should have charged more for carrying out such a brutal act, which is quite a callous thing to say. He was charged, as I say, and he appeared before the courts on the island.
Manx law is different from English law. You don't have Acts of Parliament, you have Acts of Tynwald. You have judgments made by the Manx courts. They pay a lot of attention to English courts, but they make their own decisions. And obviously Manx legislation, Manx statutes being passed.
In the UK, murder was always subject to common law, and then later on they brought in legislation, I think they call it the Homicide Act, but common law is law which has just evolved over the years. And then we had an old criminal code going back to about 1872, which covered a lot of offences. And so Manx law would be our own legislation passed by our own parliament, and not necessarily following the UK. In fact, in many cases it was different than the UK. If a law is passed in the UK, it wasn't automatically passed in the Isle of Man. So, for example, a Theft Act in the UK came out about 1968, I think, but the Isle of Man, it didn't come out till 1981. Just the way we did things here. Same with the court procedure. We would have, in the UK, they'd have 12 jurors, but in the Isle of Man, we still only have 7. Our judges are called deemsters, and we have our own appeals court, where they bring in judges from the UK for the appeals court. But ultimately, the person in charge of our court system is the Queen, or the King, or the Queen as it was then. So she has the overall power at the Home Office to deal with any criminal offences any sentences which took place on the Isle of Man, which is what happened in the Tony Tia case.
The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, which had come into force in 1984-1985 and for the rest of Britain, didn't apply on the Isle of Man, and the protections it afforded to suspects, to those accused of crimes, were simply not available to people languishing on remand in jail in Douglas, Isle of Man's capital. When they got his confession, the police had not given Tony Tia access to a lawyer. Worse, when the murder weapon, the supposed murder weapon, the craft knife which had slashed Corinne Bentley's throat was found by a local resident, the police blithely told him, "Oh, just throw it away and forget about it." And so when Tier's case came to court, he pleaded not guilty to murder and demanded that his confession, the only real evidence against him, should be excluded. He hadn't been given a lawyer when he made it. What's more, the knife had never been recovered, so there was no way of testing it for forensics. And for good measure, his lawyer also argued that the police on the Isle of Man had failed to disclose a host of other potentially exculpatory evidence. None of this mattered. Those laws, those protections simply didn't apply.
He just sat there. He never gave evidence. In fact, the defence didn't call any witnesses. They just relied on the old thing in law is that the prosecution have to prove their case. He didn't give evidence and there were no witnesses called. What came out of the trial was that there was some conflict in the household. But the family weren't happy with Corinne being a boyfriend of Elliot. So the common law husband of Elliot's sister went to Tony Tier and offered him hundreds of pounds. There was always a bit of question about what the actual words were, to get rid of her or to kill her, but that was what led up to Tony Tier getting involved. And there was some evidence later on that a large sum of money had been paid into his bank account at about the same time as this allegation was made, so there was some evidence to support that. I remember people saying, "What?" You know, they were hearing about it then, and it was obviously on the local radio and the newspapers, and it was a big, then the trial was a big thing. And even today, you know, people remember it and think about how horrific it all was. The trial only lasted 3 days, and I think the jury were out 7 hours, so it was a big event at the time, but it didn't last a long time, because as I say, it was a reasonably straightforward case.
And when the jury returned their verdict, they found Tony Tier guilty of the murder of Corinne Bentley. And the judge, the Deemster, as he's titled under Manx law, imposed the only sentence available under Manx law for murder: death.
The Deemster Callow, or the judge, Deemster Callow, just said you'd been found guilty, and the Deemster came out with what an horrendous crime this was on a poor innocent girl, and then he said, "But you've been found guilty of murder, and I'm going to impose on you the only sentence that the law allows me to, and that is you'd be taken from this place and you'd be hanged by the neck until you're dead." And the way he said it, and it was quite a moment, to be honest with you. He could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. I'm not too sure whether people in there, a lot of people in there who were there, the family, quite realised what was going to happen. We did, because we knew what the law is. When I say me, the police officers who dealt with it knew, but any public that were in there would not have known. And when you hear a judge say something like that, in fact, the shivers have gone down the back of my neck now, thinking about it. I think you might find he was the last person in the British Islands to be sentenced to death.
We see the death penalty as being a product of a bygone era. It's something historical. It's what our less civilized ancestors did, you know, to convict someone and then send them to the gallows. And so this case was particularly shocking because it reminded people that even in the early 1990s, you know, this civilized era, there was still the death penalty on the Isle of Man, that the judge would still put on the black cap when they were sentencing someone to death. And it's that kind of remnant of this kind of less civilized, apparently, era that survived. And that's quite shocking, actually, when you think about how relatively recently this was. People are always surprised that the Isle of Man actually had the death penalty far later into the 1990s. Although it hadn't been carried out for some time, it was still on the statute books. The case has got a lot of interest because Tony Tier was the last man to be sentenced to death on the Isle of Man, even though people knew that it would get commuted. They knew that he wouldn't be executed.
Basically, up until the 1960s, you had a situation where the Isle of Man had capital punishment, execution, really for murder. That was the only crime that which would result in a death penalty. And frequently they were commuted, dropped down to life imprisonment. In the 1960s, England, the United Kingdom, turned away from capital punishment. So you have the abolition of capital punishment for murder during the 1960s. The Isle of Man chose not to follow. So from the 1960s, you have this position where the Manx Tynwald has laid down in an Act of Tynwald that the mandatory punishment for murder is death. Meanwhile, less than 20 miles across the sea, in England, the Home Secretary would never allow the Manx authorities to execute. Imagine the political cost of a Home Secretary in a country which bans execution, allowing somebody to be executed for a crime in British territory 20 miles offshore, where the Home Secretary has the power to stop it by the exercise of mercy. So from 1960s up until 1990s, you have a pattern of convicted murderers receiving the prerogative of mercy down to life imprisonment, and it was quite clear to me from talking to some of the people at who were involved around the time that this was not a matter of judgment. It was automatic. The Home Secretary would never allow a Manx murderer to be executed.
A court would sentence a man like Tony Tier to death and would remand him in a condemned cell in the prison on Douglas to await his fate. The condemned man would then apply to the British government to have that sentence commuted, and quietly the Isle of Man would agree. And that's what had happened in the 3 previous murder cases and death sentences which had been handed down in the second half of the 20th century. Tier's case was to be slightly different.
So Tier is convicted of murder, mandatory sentence is death. He knows he isn't going to be executed. Everybody knows he isn't going to be executed. He then secures a retrial, and between his first trial and his second trial, the Manx Tynwald says, actually, we can't carry on like this. It is not sensible to have a system where somebody has to be sentenced to death and we all know it's not going to happen. It makes a mockery of it. And so, in between those 2 trials, the Manx Tynwald abolished the death sentence in the Isle of Man.
He appealed, he got a new lawyer, and he appealed, and UK organisation that tries to deal with miscarriages of justice got involved because they felt that the case was purely based on a confession, just the confession and nothing else, because there was no forensic evidence. And two English barristers agreed to come over and represent him, and he was given a new trial. His appeal was granted. And much of the evidence of that trial was repeated. However, there was some extra evidence where a health worker who'd been interviewing Tony whilst he was in prison, serving a sentence, Tony admitted to him what he'd done in quite detail. So that health worker came along and gave evidence in the trial, and he was convicted on the second occasion.
This time, though, he was not sentenced to death because by 1994, when his second trial took place, the Isle of Man had finally caught up with the rest of mainland Britain, and the island's parliament, the Tynwald, had formally abolished the death penalty. Tony Tier was sentenced instead to life in prison.
He was both the last person to be sentenced to death and the first person to receive a mandatory life sentence after the death penalty was removed from the statutes. So that's why it's had so much attention from a legal history perspective. And I think because of that, we lose sense of what the actual crime was and who the victim was.
Initially, the Manx prison was actually the castle, so it was sort of a fortification which also doubled as a prison. Then there was a purpose-built prison in the Victorian era, but one of the big problems the Isle of Man faces is that the prison population is very varied. If you're a prisoner serving a short term for theft, you may be quite differently placed from somebody facing a life sentence for murder. So meeting the needs of different prisoners is really difficult. You have men and women may need to be treated differently, young offenders may need to be treated differently. So one of the ways the Isle of Man gets around that is to basically subcontract into the English prison system. And typically somebody with a very long sentence, particularly around the time of Tyr, would actually serve that sentence in an English prison. So Tyr was convicted in the Manx system, but because there weren't really the facilities in the Isle of Man to deal with a life prisoner, he was sent to a specialist unit in England which has long-term prisoners.
On the surface, it's a really sad, tragic, really, case of a hapless would-be murderer for hire and the disadvantaged young woman whom he slaughtered. I think the lesson which needs to be drawn from this is that the Isle of Man and the other two Crown dependencies like it are an anachronism. They are a loophole within our unwritten constitution, and frankly they're a loophole that needs to be closed.
I think if there hadn't been the Tyr sentence of death, there would not have been immediately following the abolition. Probably the Isle of Man would have abolished the death penalty in the next 10 or 15 years anyway. There were broader international things happening which would have made it very difficult to retain. But I think a recognition that rather than pretending to have the death penalty, the Isle of Man should recognise that mandatory life was the penalty for murder, was a legacy of the Tyr trial.
At the centre of every murder trial, every murder case, there is a victim. And this is such a particularly sad case because Corinne's identity has been almost lost. She is remembered to her family, but when you see coverage about this case, it's focusing on the legal aspects of it, and therefore her murderer gets more attention than she does. He gets that status as being the last person sentenced to death, of being the first person to receive this mandatory life sentence. And who is Corinne? She should be at the centre of this, and instead she seems to be on the fringes while her murderer takes centre place, and that is really wrong.
Corinne and her family received the justice they deserved, definitely. And which I only played a small part of it, but the lads who actually investigated it, that's to their credit that they were able to bring justice to Corinne and her family.
At the end of the day, we're humans, we wear a uniform, whether or not you agree or disagree with what the police do. And there's often an argument, certainly in the Isle of Man, that where police officers are overpaid, it's a quiet place, they don't earn their money. And often enough, it's like in many jobs, you're not paid necessarily for what you do, it's what you may have to do. And I hope that the majority of people in the Isle of Man would never go through a number of incidents I've gone through and things I've seen and witnessed and had to deal with. It's probably the most memorable of things for a number of reasons, and it's one that haunts me. These sort of things they have an impact. It had an impact for a long, long time. It's still there now. I didn't used to talk about it. I suppose post-traumatic stress disorder, you call it, because I wasn't expecting to find her, and it's that sudden finding her. It does have a massive impact.
It was one of the most shocking in relation to the circumstances of it. It was one of the most surprising as to how it worked out with the confession straight away. I mean, that doesn't happen every day in the week. And it was a pretty horrific case as far as history of the Isle of Man's concerned. So it wasn't particularly nice.
In this case, it's Tony Tier who tends to be remembered because of his dubious status as the last man to be sentenced to death on the Isle of Man. But it's Kareem Bentley who should be remembered, killed for no reason for just £600.